Greetings, Internet! Welcome to episode number 148 of the Comic Walker Show. I'm your host, Meyer. With me, as always, is my trusty boo himself, mighty Mike Eakins. Mike, how the heck are you this week?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Thanks for asking.
I'm stoked too. It's been a really good week. It's been crazy busy. I mean, it's the week before Thanksgiving, but I'm super grateful because we have writer of That Texas Blood, CHRIS Condon, hanging out with us this week. Chris, how the heck are you, buddy?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. It's nice to be here. Thank you for asking me to be on the show. I'm really happy to be here.
Hey, listen, I mean, I was kind of giddy like a schoolgirl when you accepted our invite because, like, man, this dude's comic is so good. You know, it's not to say that, you know, we get other guests and they're terrible and we don't like their comics and we're just playing nice with them or anything like that. But it really does. It strikes nicely when it's like, I really want to talk about this book. I love this comic. And of course, this isn't, you know, you didn't just come out of nowhere with this. You've been around for a minute, you know, and now you and JACOB Phillips are really kicking the mainstream, or maybe not kicking the mainstream's ass quite so much, but wedging your way into the mainstream. How has the critical response to That Texas Blood been for you guys?
Well, the critical response has been up and down. I feel like the first issue came out and we got a good response from that one. But the interesting thing about that issue was that it was a one shot.
Yep, right.
And a lot of people were put off by that or were sort of uneasy about it. Like, how do I approach a book in which its first issue is a one shot? Which to me, it just totally makes sense. I mean, I like doing that. I thought that it was, for me, a smart idea of introducing people to this world that we were creating.
It gives us the world. It gives us Sheriff Joe Bob.
Yeah, and then
that's good.
Yeah, personally, I liked it, but I mean, obviously, you're not going to get everybody to like it. But people, overall, I feel like they really liked that first issue. Where we kind of lost people was with the first arc. Some people thought it was too slow. Other people loved it for its pace. Some people, I think, thought it was almost too, I'm trying to think of a better word, but novelistic is like the word that comes to mind. But like, again, like we came up and down on, the critics on that. There was one critic in particular that didn't like us very much. And on Comic Book Roundup, dipped our score tremendously. However, on the second arc here, we've been doing fantastically critically. Everybody seems to really be enjoying this new arc. Is really connecting with it, and I really don't think that the second arc would have worked as well if the first arc didn't go the way that it did. And I think that maybe now with the second arc existing, people can go back and sort of revisit, and maybe they'll have a new appreciation for it and what it did.
And what the current arc is really doing, aside from fleshing out the history and just the world itself of Ambrose County, at least this is my interpretation, is that it's really expanding what the book itself is capable of, right? Yeah. I mean, your first issue, okay, 70-year-old small town sheriff, this is his life. Awesome stuff. Great character piece. Joe Bob and Texas are both set up as characters unto themselves. And then we've got more of a modern crime story, a revenge story. And, it could go, okay, let's just do more crime stuff from there, right? But instead, we're going to go back 40 years and let's talk about Satanists. And it works so well because you get this sense that there's just something askew with Ambrose County throughout the first arc. Like, it's just like kind of just a shithole, but also there's just something not right. Is it supernatural? Is it, who the hell knows? But that ambiguity really lends itself to a lot of things.
Yeah.
I assume that's what you were hoping to go for with this.
Absolutely. The atmosphere was really important to me in the writing of it, and I'm really happy that everything that Jacob has done is really reinforced that. The atmosphere is one of impending doom. I want to say, but yeah, I mean, the second arc has really, it fleshes out, like you said, that, a little bit more of the history of the place. And especially if people have been following along with the back matter, that's really giving you even more of a historical basis for everything that's coming. And I what you said before about this is really, this arc kind of changes what this series can be. I feel like it's not out yet, but the issue 13, which is out in December, which is a standalone issue, which isn't going to be collected in either volume 2 or 3. I think that it pushes it even further into what we can do with the series, in that and this is in the copy on Image, so the solicitation material, so I'm not ruining anything for you, but it's a story that Sheriff Sam is telling in 1981 at the Christmas party. And so you're able to do a lot more because it's fiction. You're able to play with things, and it's really fun to kind of do that, almost like a little bit of hometown folklore kind of stuff.
Yes.
Because it's a story, so you can get away with a lot more in it, but also sort of adding even more to that atmosphere that we were already layering on, and really layering on in this last arc.
Mike, go ahead, jump in, bud.
Yeah. Chris, once again, thanks for hanging out with us. I gotta ask you something that for me that sticks out with this story is Texas itself is pretty much just as big as characters as Sheriff Joe Bob is.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think this book could take place like, in old world Chicago or something like that and have the same draw, the same just I forget the word I'm looking for, but either way, how does that happen? Was that organic? Is that when you were writing it, or did Texas just kind of happen because it's Texas, it's small time country, stuff like that?
Well, I mean, I kind of fell in love with Texas when visiting Texas. When I was just, driving through with my father many years ago, there was something about Texas. The grasshoppers were like this big.
Jesus.
And that was in the Panhandle. And, I eventually became friends with somebody who is from West Texas, which is where our story takes place. So I was able to go down and visit that area and just fell in love with it, because it really does just seem like a blank canvas for somebody who creates stories. The people that you meet have that sort of world weariness, but they tell you a lot of information just by the looks in their eyes, things like that. And Texas just lent itself to that. But I mean, I had come up with a whole lot of stories that took place in Texas because I liked Texas. I was always a fan of pulp stuff that took place in Texas, like Jim Thompson, and I westerns in general I love. But so I had all these stories that were set in Texas, but they weren't necessarily the same place. And then when we were coming up with the comic book, and we decided that we wanted to do a series, all of a sudden I was, struck by the idea of what if all of these stories that I came up with took place in the same exact place in the same county, and all of a sudden we had our series. And so characters who, were not necessarily going to be in something, now all of a sudden the story that maybe wasn't working before because I hadn't gotten it clicking before, all of a sudden it clicks because now this person's in it and this thing works because this person's uncle is in it, and it's just everything starts working. And again, that was just sort of Texas is just that way anyway. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I can't imagine it taking place in like New Jersey or New York or Chicago.
Right.
I mean, and even like any of the other like rural places, I don't think it could take place in Iowa or even Oklahoma,
Texas,
it's got its own ambiance to it, and I think that we're enough to have picked up that ambiance in our book, and it seems that people are picking it up too. We actually had a couple today. I did a signing with Julio Ante today in New York City, and we actually had a couple who was visiting from Austin, and they didn't come for us, but they were fans of home and they were fans of that Texas blood, and they asked me where I was from in Texas, and I was like, I'm not from Texas. Had to tell them, and they were shocked. But honestly, like, I'm really happy to have so many people think that I'm from Texas, because that just means that the book's working.
Oh, I mean, I'm just north of there in Oklahoma right now, so I definitely can feel what you're talking about with that particular ambiance. And Oklahoma is a little different from Texas and Missouri, and et cetera. One thing that I am curious about is the small town atmosphere, because there's a very good and strong and rich tradition in crime fiction of the small town mystery, right?
Right.
If you could speak to that just a little bit, and how you made the decision to go that route with this story, and kind of what influenced you, and just maybe even real life instant occasions that kind of fed into that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a small town. It's a 2 square mile town in New Jersey. It's called Metuchen, and you generally know everybody. And it was always fascinating to me, learning something that I had otherwise not known, and being shocked by it, like shocked by a certain story about this one person, and realizing that they were not at all like the person that I thought they were, and that was just from an early age, just, sort of living through that. But, in Texas, again, just visiting the place, like, so where my friend is from is Fort Davis and Marfa. That's where he's from, and that's very much where we're basing our fictional county off of. It's even more so, it's even smaller than what I grew up with, and it's even more tight knit, but even more cliquey in some ways.
Right.
But there's, so for example, one of the things that I was told when I was given the keys to a pickup truck to borrow this pickup to go to the bar or whatever, and they were, whatever you do when you pass somebody, give them the salute, because otherwise they're going to think I'm being rude. And so I was okay, that, but so it's like that sort of stuff where it's like, somebody could turn on somebody just because they didn't say hi, or things like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, and
no, the small town wave, man.
Yeah.
Don't lift your hand off the wheel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. But yeah. So, in terms of fiction that inspired me, in terms of the the small town vibe, I think definitely Pop 1280 by Jim Thompson. Fantastic. I actually didn't read this until like I was already midway through the second arc, but The Killer Inside Me, which wound up being a very big influence on issue 13. But issue 13 is also based on a real person, which I'll get into once the issue comes out, because I don't want to spoil anything. But so those two definitely, and those are both set in Texas. And then I would also say something like Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, big influence on that sort of small town not being what you think it is, being in danger in a small town, and then right down to things like Nightmare on Elm Street, So
now you're talking Mike's language.
Right.
Fantastic movie, by the way.
Well, yeah.
Gorgeous.
But there's so many things that, especially for me, I just try to read a lot and watch a lot, and I try to be as open about my influences as I can. Also, I mean, what would I be without my influences?
Sure. How about Preacher?
Yeah, I loved Preacher.
I was gonna say, like,
Yeah.
I can't imagine you came up with this comic and did not read Preacher at some point.
Yeah, I was that was one of those you almost feel naughty when you're reading Preacher.
Listen, man, that comic at 17 changed my life.
Yeah,
in a lot of good ways. So
yeah.
hell yeah. Mike, go ahead, jump in, bud.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, at times we see, Sheriff Joe Bob. He is kind of like, the epitome of Texas. He's grizzled veteran. He's kind of torn between the love of his small town, his community, but also the love of the police force, and kind of that battle. We almost kind of see that the mental battle and then the physical battle in both arcs. Where does Sheriff come from, and what kind of keeps him in Ambrose County?
I mean, he's born and raised in Ambrose County. I think that's partly why he stays in Ambrose County. I think that he loves it and he hates it at the same time. I think that it's really hard for him to wrestle. I think that he's wrestling constantly with this, just the good and the bad of it. There's so many people that he loves in it. There's so many good things that he loves about it. And I think this is true about Texas in general, to be honest with you. This is honestly how I feel about Texas, is that there's so many things that I love about it, and then there's so many things that I just find so troubling. This goes down to, one of the times that I was in Alpine with a friend. My friend is from Texas, and we're at a bar, and we're visiting a friend of ours who actually came out. I lived in Los Angeles for a little bit, and he had come to visit us. So he was working at a bar. He was a bartender there. And we were talking to him, and then another guy came over, and he was friendly with this guy. And this guy was a firefighter. And we're talking with this guy, and the guy just, throws out the N-word at towards the end of the conversation. And I'm just like, ooh, I thought we were, simpatico. I thought we were on the same wavelength, but it's just the way that these people's minds work sometimes is not the same as mine, and that's something that I've been trying to capture in the comic, is that the way that things work there isn't exactly, it's shades of moral grays. And it's not black and white, and I think that that's something that I tried to nail in the second arc. I'm not sure if I did it completely well, but I think that was something that I was trying to deal with, especially with 2020 and Black Lives Matter, definitely. And obviously the defund the police stuff and all that. I was I was sort of grappling with that myself, and I was writing this at the same time, and I feel like it definitely filtered in unintentionally. I will say I didn't intentionally set out to write this thing. I wanted to write a story about a cult, and this wound up being the thing that I wrote. So, it sort of happened by osmosis, not, intentionally. So, but yeah, I mean, as for Sheriff Joe Bob, I mean, he's a haunted person in that he's constantly wrestling with the past.
Right.
And his past mistakes. And I'm kind of that way too. I linger on my regrets and things that I should have done, things that I did that I shouldn't have done, all those things. And so I identify with him in that way. But I sort of up the ante with him. Sorry. Go ahead. Sorry about that. No, I just sort of up the ante with him because, they're literally life or death stakes.
Sure.
So in terms of in the first issue, we see sort of a mention of Sheriff Sam was gunned down by his brother in the dream sequence. We learned this fact. And in the second arc, we're introduced to Sheriff Sam. He's very much alive, and he doesn't, nothing happens to him in this arc. And what we'll see in the third arc will be sort of involving that a little bit more. And sort of the immediate fallout regarding that sort of cataclysmic moment in his life. And he's had a few of those, and I think that this is something that I find very fascinating about sort of rural life, is the life and death aspect of it. My father grew up on a farm in Iowa. And I'm actually working on another thing that sort of is dealing with the same exact thing, but more in a familial way. But you have 10 siblings, and 5 of them die young. What's it like to your father dies young? When my father, for example, his father died when he was 3, and he had 3 siblings, 2 siblings that died early. One in a tragic accident, a boating accident, the other one from a heart defect. Things like that. So it's like, how does that sort of change a person, and how does that affect them, and how does that change how they interact with their environment and all that? And so that's basically what I'm exploring. So it's all fun stuff, really. But yeah,
well, you don't play with small stakes.
Right. Well,
nothing easy about writing what you just described.
Right.
But it's important to me. So,
and so let's get into your partnership with Jacob a little bit, because
sure.
At Texas Blood, not your first collaboration. How did you guys meet? How did you become such strong creative partners together?
Well, so technically, that Texas Blood was our first collaboration, but it was in the wings when we decided to do Brutal Dark. So
okay.
So what happened was I was trying to make a film that was called Passes Prologue. It was a short film, and the idea was there was going to kickstart a feature film. And I was reading Kill or Be Killed at the time, and Jacob was doing the backups. He was doing like an illustration for the backups, and I really loved what he was doing, and I thought it'd be good for concept artwork. So I emailed his DeviantArt page and said, hey, I have a script that I'm working on. I want concept art done. I think that will help me get funding. If you like the script, maybe you want to do it. And so he said, send me the script. So I sent him the script. He liked it. That's when we started working together. It was 2017.
Wow. Just like that.
That's awesome.
And that was very much.
Yeah, that's amazing.
But we were very we weren't friendly at that time. It was very business. I sent him stuff, he sends me stuff, and then we sort of stopped talking. And then so this was maybe December 2018, I think. I emailed him again because I couldn't get the funding together, and I said, hey, I've always loved comics. I've been thinking about, because my thing isn't so much that I'm trying to make a movie or whatever. My point is that I kind of want to just stories, so whatever medium I can fit them into, I love novels. I love comic books. I love movies. And the idea of adapting what was once a screenplay into a comic was kind of exciting to me. And I had been thinking about it for a different project. And then I already realized I already have this thing with Jacob. He's already done artwork. So let me see if he'd want to do it as comic book. So I emailed him and asked him, and he said, yeah, I was excited to do it. So I quickly had to come up with, this was where the idea for the series really came from. Was I was like, I guess I need a series idea here. So I took what was that feature film, and that became like the final arc. And then, so I came up with all these different story arcs and sort of figured out, okay, this is a little bit, a little bit more horror. This is a little bit more crime. This is this, mm-hmm. And kind of came up with the series there because it's everything that I like. And wrote up a quick pitch script, sent it to Jacob. By the end of January 2019, we had a pitch and we were sending it out. And that was really it. But at that point, we had become much more friendly because we were just emailing back and forth. And then soon enough, we were just Instagramming back and forth. At which point today, we literally, pretty much every day we're talking. Nice. And we both are very much aware of what's going on in each other's lives. He sends pictures of his kittens and I send pictures of my puppy. But yeah, I think that what we're attracted to with the stories that we're telling is just we both like that the real sort of aspect of it, in which we're sort of just I like slice of life things, and so does he. We
Right.
both like 70s cinema, which was very much slice of life stories, and just sort of exploring a lot of character pieces, and we like character pieces. So that was sort of, I think, where we kind of bonded. And then also just the fact that we're making a comic, which is, fairly intensive, especially for him, considering he does so much of the work.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much the story in how we got to working together and how we collaborate.
That's awesome.
Very cool.
How did you wind up at Image then? I mean, you said you sent the pitch out, so I'm sure
Yeah.
Image wasn't.
So I was
wasn't the
actually
only
talking
place.
to Jeremy Holt and Julio Anta about this, and so they were shocked that I told them that I had literally just sent it to the submissions email. So so there was no guarantee, right? So first of all, we didn't put, Jacob Phillips, criminal, Jacob Phillips, killer. We didn't put anything in the book. We just put our names on it, and just sent it out everywhere. And yeah, I remember I even said to Jake, I was like, you know what, it's free. Let's just send it to Image. I don't think we're going to get it. I could probably find the email right now if I wanted to. But I literally said to him, I don't think we're going to get Image, but let's just do it. Why not? And he was like, okay, cool. Yeah, let's do it. So about 3 months in, we had gotten a couple no's. Mostly like they were, this is good, but we can't find a place for it right now, kind of things. And then we got in touch with Image. Eric emailed me. I was literally at a Chipotle with my little cousins, and and I get an email, and I'm like, I think I have a comic book now. And so at that point, I'm like, oh crap, I got to write scripts. I hadn't written any scripts yet. I had all this. I planned things out. I hadn't written any actual scripts yet, so I had to sit down and actually hammer out a script and figure out how to write a full comic script. And yeah, so that was that was how it happened. There was no real, there was no game plan. I mean, I feel like a dunce talking to Julio and Jeremy, because I'm like, they're like telling me all this, nitty gritty. Oh, I emailed this person. I'm networking.
Right.
And I'm just sitting there going like, this stuff just happened to me,
I got real lucky.
Maybe, I don't know. I feel like I'm just maybe doing it wrong, but like somehow it's been working out.
Well, I mean, not for nothing. It is a damn good comic, but then at the same time, you could sit there and second guess yourself all day and be like, well, there's plenty of good comics out there that nobody ever reads or never get a chance of seeing the light of day. So I mean, either or, whatever you did worked. So pro tip, kids, somebody does look at those submission links.
I actually did a talk last week at my alma mater, Montclair State University in New Jersey, and one of the points that I kept driving home was that there's nothing special about my case. I mean, obviously, the writing and whatever you write is going to be uniquely yours. That's true.
Right.
However, there's nothing unique about me breaking into the industry or anybody else breaking into the industry. All it takes is, I mean, I'm not going to say that I didn't work to get where we are. Definitely, I worked at getting things out there, but it's just, I didn't do it in the same way that these other people did. It seemed like for me, when we got picked up, it was pretty much through 2019. And I knew that we were going to be coming out in May of 2020, and I was all excited about it. And, I was figuring out, oh, maybe I can go to Comic-Con and do all this, sort of promotion stuff. And then the pandemic happened. So by the time that my first real comic came out, everybody's in lockdown. I can't go to a comic convention. And I really, I don't know the game of how you do comics.
Right,
How
right.
do you sell yourself? How do you do this? How do you do that? So that was a real learning curve, and I'm still learning, But yeah, there's nothing unique about the story of, just getting your stuff out there. I think if the stuff is good, whatever you're doing, somebody will find it. Just keep sending it out there. You know, there's gonna be a lot of no's, but you know, don't let it discourage you. I think that's the big thing. I got a lot of no's. You know, I used to send the same exact thing that is that first issue.
Mm-hmm.
It was exactly the same thing as a screenplay. Exactly
Oh, really?
the same thing. And it got so many no's and so many bad marks and this and that and the other. And I kept saying it's, you know, it's been picked up as a comic, and I'm just like, it was the same thing. It's just that when it's in black and white, it's hard for people to see it, you know? Whereas when it's in full color and you're looking at faces and you're able to, and that's what Jacob is so good at, and why our collaboration is so good. I mean, I'm really fortunate to have him on my team, is that, you know, he just really brings whatever I write to life. And apparently, you know, in screenplay form, maybe it just wasn't doing it for people. I also think that I didn't exactly write in the format that people want you to write in screenplay, which is what maybe part of the issue was, that they want you to do a certain thing. And I don't like to write in the A plus B equals C format. You know,
Sure, right.
I like I said, you know, you've read the first issue, which it's a slice of life story. It's literally just a day in the life of this guy. That doesn't necessarily make a sellable screenplay, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know.
It's hard to elevator pitch that.
Yeah.
So I
A little
get that. Mike, jump in, buddy.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of the screenplays, and you touched on being a fan of 70s cinema. This has a great, almost cinematic feel to it, almost like a early mid 80s, you know, Dallas TV type of show. What were some of your influences when creating, even kind of converting it from a screenplay to a comic? What have been some of your influences as far as the screenplays and stuff like that?
One of my big influences in just kind of breaking things down in the comic was everything Darwin Cook has ever done. Big time influence on me just in general.
Very
good. I really just, I looked at, I have his I forget what it's called, but it's the DC graphics. It's like all of his works for DC, or all the smaller works, I guess.
Yeah.
And they have this one issue that's just silent. It's the first thing he ever did for DC, and it's like a silent issue. And I looked at that because, you know, if you break that page, I mean, if you look at what we came up with, eventually you're going to be like, oh, I don't really see how this would influence. But in terms of just looking at a page and going, this silent panel in which there's no dialogue or, you know, onomatopoeia or whatever, you know, this leads to this, and you tell a full story, but silently in like 3 pages. And so trying to, you know, just sort of being a student of that and just sort of examining that and looking it over was very influential. His Parker books were always influential. I look at the first page of the first Parker book, and look, that's always my like goal, is to make something half as good as that. You know, so that's always something in the back of my mind. In terms of movies, Paris, Texas was a big influence. The Wim Wenders film, Paris, Texas, starring Harry Dean Stanton. Yeah, that was a really big influence. I mean, HUD was a big influence on the second arc, which is a Martin Ritt film, Texas, actually based off of a Larry McMurtry novel called Horsemen Pass By. That was a big influence on that story. Touch of Evil, Orson Welles. I mean, there's so many. There really are just so. I mean, I wish I could just keep pinpointing where things came, but it literally goes from, you know, things that are very obvious to things that are not very obvious. Like The Conversation is one of my very favorite films, and is very much influenced on everything I do, just because it's very character driven, but you know, the plot is fantastic. But it's you really get to explore this character, Harry Call, throughout the entirety of that movie, you know. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to pinpoint things, but there's so many things that were big influences on just me while I was writing, but Paris, Texas was a huge one. I wish I could say No Country was a big influence, but it actually wasn't. It was more so. I mean, I'm a big fan of that movie,
Yeah.
but it was not an influence on how I wrote or what I wrote.
Sure.
What influenced me the most in how I wrote and what I wrote was actually just being in Texas.
Okay.
Oh wow. Okay.
In terms of actually writing about Texas. But yeah, but don't get me wrong. I love Cormac McCarthy and I absolutely adore that movie. The Coen brothers are fantastic. And when people say that any of my writing is like reminiscent of them, I take that as a huge compliment.
Oh, you've got to.
Oh, absolutely you do.
Because they're fantastic. They really are.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think they've made a bad movie. So let's move into Eversol 1981. Very different flair and sensibility than the opening arc because one, it's a period piece, and it is definitely hard for me to look back and know that 1 year after I was born is now a period piece in my lifetime. Damn it. But it really, and I'm sure a lot of this has to do with the attention to detail that Jacob puts in the art, but like it just feels like the early 80s, late 70s, that sort of crossing over of decades era where things are bleeding together. And of course, you've got the added bonus of Joe Bob is younger and Sam's not dead. And things of that nature, and the vehicles and the clothing styles. But when it gets down into the details and the way people interact with one another, the freedom that kids have to just run amok outside, and it all just rings very true. And I just really appreciate how did you nail the vibe so well of an era that, unless you had a Wayback Machine, I don't think you were a part of?
I have a Wayback Machine.
Okay. Fair enough.
Damn it.
We've cracked the code.
This is going to sound cheesy, but I think that the characters really drive it. And that's about as... The best answer that I can give you is that if the characters didn't feel true, I don't think that I would have been able to write it. But the characters felt true, and I mean, so this is something that just goes back to me growing up. I have older parents, and so everything that I've grown up with has been like, I feel like I bounce around between decades. Because I was introduced to the Fleischer Supermans. And Donald Duck cartoons, and Howdy Doody, and we had tapes of Ed Sullivan with the Beatles and the Doors and all this.
Yeah,
nice.
Next to like literally like the Spice Girls in the '90s and like all these. So I was like living between decades for a lot of it. So, and my parents very much, like, most of the stuff they had was from like the late '70s, early '80s. Like they didn't. They didn't come from money, and they didn't have a lot of money, so a lot of the stuff was sort of just carryovers from whatever they had. So I feel like that definitely influenced how I sort of saw things, in which I sort of just like, all right, let me put myself back in, when I grew up. But something that you mentioned was that this sort of crossover time between the 70s and the 80s. That's something that fascinates me. Is that the first 2 or 3 years after a decade ends, there's still that hangover of the previous decade before the decade's real influence comes.
There's this intermingling of things that we associate from one and the other decade. They're kind of commingling and merging together. And like, if you look at the 70s versus the 80s, they couldn't stylistically be different. I mean, in terms of music, movies, pop culture, clothing. But there is that weird period there from like 78 to maybe 82. And I mean, there's this sort of bleed over in every crossing between decades, sure. But it just gets really weird. Like and I say that in this case, one of the things you tapped into really well is there was a lot of weird culty urban legend stuff happening in the 70s, and that sort of transmogrified in the 80s into the Satanic Panic.
Yeah.
And you know, then when you pull back the curtain, it's just a bunch of weebs in kind of cheap looking red cloaks. And I just what brought you to bring this element into Ambrose County?
Well, I just like that sort of story. Honestly, like part of it was, so I mean, if people have been reading, the listeners have been reading the issues, there's this character Wellman that's introduced, and he's this sort of rock and roll photographer, and that sort of brings me into this whole thing that I really enjoy, is this sort of 70s rock culture, which was
Very
like bleed
sleazy.
over, which is this bleed over from the 60s. And because Mick Jagger and some other, so one of the guys that I actually got to know in Marfa, who's unfortunately passed away now, he was the artist who did the Eagles covers.
Okay.
So this is all kind of stuff that was really interesting to play with, and then to sort of mash that with this idea of doing like a cult,
right? Why wouldn't there be a cult in small town Texas, right? It's not just for Los Angeles freaks anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get political, but there was certain stuff that was happening, again in like 2020 when I was working on this, and so it was there was certain stuff that was happening that I was sort of lingering in my mind about cult, and cult of personality, and also cult of being a cult. So yeah, there's all sorts of things, but I don't know. I sort of wanted to start, because I'll be honest with you, people have been detecting some horror elements in our story, and that's good, because there are horror elements in our story, and I wanted to start layering them in even more. And how do I do that? Well, let me introduce a cult. So because horror and crime to me are one and the same, or they're like a Janus head almost, where it's like they play into each other. There's nothing more terrifying to me than looking at an unsolved serial killer,
right?
And seeing like crime scene photos, but then seeing these sketches of what this guy may have looked like, and they always look like Ghost or something. They're just black and white with beady eyes, and you're just like, this is terrifying.
This is a terrible drawing.
Yeah, also just a terrible drawing. So yeah,
Jacob, get over here. Pretty this up.
Yeah, I mean that's really it. I mean, I think that there's a reason that you'll see a police in a horror story a lot, is because crime and horror go hand in hand. I truly believe that, and I think that that's something that we wanted to, but I also really just felt like I wanted to explore in this new arc and sort of introduce it so that we can play with it later as we want to, and that way it doesn't hit people weird coming later.
Sure.
But yeah, that's my answer.
Oh, that's awesome though. Mike, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, for sure. Earlier you touched on the characters and their driving force through the story. In the second arc, we see a young Sheriff Joe Bob. He has that vigor back. We're kind of, bouncing back. We see a lot of his wife, who is keeping him grounded. How much, when you were writing, the modern Joe Bob in the diner, and then we were going back to the younger Joe Bob, the flashbacks, how much of that character was talking to you and kind of driving you? Well, a young Joe Bob looks like this, he does this, and vices the more mature, almost mentoring Joe Bob that we see in the diner.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could say that. So I wish I could say that I really remember picturing him that way.
Sure.
But to me, it was more so just knowing what this other Joe Bob has endured, the older Joe Bob.
Sure.
And just sort of looking at the innocence of the younger Joe Bob, who, if my calculations are correct, he's 30 in 81. So, you know, it's really interesting to just sort of think about that in terms of how does this younger, you know, guy who doesn't have a kid yet, he has you know, eventually has a kid, and his kid's, you know, a jerk. he's living out in Oklahoma City. He hasn't seen him in probably 15 years. I'm not saying people in Oklahoma City are jerks.
Thank you. This is about to get like really awkward, if you will. Because here I sit.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was just, you know, there's so much that has happened to Joe Bob now, whereas this other Joe Bob was, you know, he just was, you know, playing with the neighborhood kids. You know, he was like, you know, he was, you know, the happy-go-lucky guy who just, you know, he had the bushy mustache and people would, you know, want to have a beer with him.
Yeah.
Whereas now he's sort of just, he's seen so many things and so many things that just haunt him that he's, you know, he still hasn't given up smoking. He's, you know, he spends nights just being like racked with guilt, and you know, I don't know, I just, for me, I don't know, that's what set it apart in terms of the writing of Joe Bob. Just keeping that in mind, that this is a more innocent character. He's still the same guy, I think, in a lot of ways, but he's definitely he's not brooding as much.
Right.
You know what I mean?
That was, like, for me, that was such a fun part, because you really got to kind of, he almost became that window. You started to kind of see like where he came from, and kind of how he got there, and what really molded him to who he is now, you know. And I think that highlighted that diner scene when they just had some good back and forth and stuff like that. And you know, it was like, you know, old cop, you know, transferred in young cop, or young-ish type of cop. And I just thought that was a great build up to where we see Joe Bob at now.
Yeah. Well, I honestly, sorry, you were mentioning the younger cop, and I mean, I actually love some of the stuff that we came up with Flores. Like, I wrote this scene in which he's telling the story about there was a man in a van who, you know, kidnapped a kid, and it could have been her.
Oof, yeah,
and
that was brutal.
The way that Jacob drew this guy in the van, I was like, like it's horrifying, and you know, I just, she's got her own stuff that, you know, is sort of fun to explore. And that's honestly, that's the thing that I really enjoy about writing this comic, is just that, you know, I like the people that we're telling these stories about, for the most part.
Sure.
You know, and I would even say, you know, some of the villains, you know, writing the villains, I even like sort of think that they're really interesting people, and I think that that's part of it, is just coming up with interesting characters, and characters that you want to write about. And I think that that's, you know, I mean, I haven't had as much either fun, but also just sort of, you know, the ease of writing that I have had with this series, just because I connect with the characters in a very easy way. Yeah.
Awesome. It's always tempting, and I think it might just be human nature, honestly, to want to sugarcoat the past and look at it through rosy-colored glasses and everything. But the nice contrast of juxtaposing older Joe Bob with younger Joe Bob, especially with this Eversol 1981 arc, is we get to see firsthand that no, 40 years ago was not better. There were terrible things happening. So yeah, like, getting out there and just deliberately kind of just slapping that notion down is pretty intense for me. But we've gotten this far in the interview, and we haven't actually talked about Eversol himself yet. And he's quite a character. I love this guy. Like, you casually drop it in, I think, in the back page matter issue 11 that's like, I really want to do a solo of this guy. And I think I speak for us all when I say, yes, please go do that.
Right.
Where does Eversol come from?
Eversol comes from, you mean the character or what?
Yeah. The character himself, I mean.
Well, I mean, in story, he comes from Iowa.
I mean, but just like he comes across.
No,
I guess
know.
I should frame my question.
I know what you're saying.
Okay.
He's very much influenced by a great television show and a great character called Carl Kolchak. And also a little bit of Fox Mulder and Dana Scully and all that. A big X-Files fan, which was it was the successor to Kolchak. But yeah, Kolchak was a big influence on this arc. I mean, that was a big influence in terms of the feel as well. As this 70s television series, a horror television series. Kolchak is a newspaper reporter. Eversol is a private detective. So that's one of the things that kind of sets them apart. But also, I just feel like Eversol has a little bit harder edge to him than Kolchak does.
He comes across in such a way that he's a little bit of a used car salesman in his way that he approaches things, and it takes.
He's a know-it-all.
Yes. Where did his personality come from? Because it's just like every scene that he's in is just very, very electric. He just livens everything up.
Well, that's really cool to hear. Because I really love his character, but I mean, I don't know where maybe he was a used car salesman at one point in his life. I don't know, but he just I love this idea of this guy who's he's a private investigator, and maybe the the cops will kind of poo-poo and be like, oh no, that's nothing. He would investigate those things, and that was really where I kind of just thought he was like an interesting person. But in terms of the voice, I don't know. I just sort of like that kind of character that you who just comes in and he's he just, as soon as you say something to him, he's like, no, that's actually an ancient yada yada yada. Like rolls off with his tongue and what this thing is.
The giant bat god.
Yeah, the big
The whole thing with in issue 11 with he's got a maquahito and Joe Bob's like, a what? And he's like, a sword, and he's like, a sword? And Eversol's like, it's a weird sword. Things like that, that he's just sort of. I almost feel like he's on an investigation with his like little cousin or something like that, right?
Well, he's that guy, and you said it perfectly. As a know-it-all, he's always got to have the last word.
Yeah.
In any given situation, and so you wind up kind of loving to hate this guy because in real life you just want to punch this guy in the neck if you met him,
which Sam wants to.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and maybe Joe Bob for at least a minute until he starts to realize, wait, there's more to this guy's story than I thought. So we're coming up, I think, next week on issue 12, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
big
things in the wind. The big finale for Eversol 1981, and then we've got the issue 13. You said was a standalone issue, and then we've got another, I guess, 5-6 issue arc after that, right?
I'm playing with the length right now. It might be 8.
Okay.
It might be 6. It might be 8. I haven't decided.
Okay.
There's ambitious. A lot. Well, the reason why is there's a lot going on. And I guess maybe it is ambitious, but I just feel like there's so much stuff that I want to tell with this particular arc. It is another story set in the past. It's set in 1992. And there's actually they don't happen too often, but there's a blizzard that comes in, and basically the rough pitch is as the blizzard comes in, so does a serial killer. So that's the
and
So that's something that I'm really enjoying figuring out right now and writing. And the 90s, obviously I grew up in the 90s, so that's kind of fun to play with. But like I said, this is set 92, and what we see is we sort of find Joe Bob the first time that he's been sheriff. He's just inherited the role of sheriff and sort of dealing with that. And this is the first time he's seeking re-election. So
Okay.
this is
Well,
why
there's going to be a little bit of political element to it. Interesting.
a little bit, but more so just the same sort of not the same. I don't want people to think it's going to be the same old, but a little bit of the same sort of introspective Joe Bob that we come to know of the modern day Joe Bob, where he's sort of saddled with regret and the pain of the past. But yeah, I think this arc is going to be really fun and really interesting and a little bit different, but again, sort of towing that line with horror and everything. But issue 13, I should say, is a standalone. However, if you've read Eversol 81, you might enjoy it a little bit more. You don't need to read Eversol 81. If you're trade waiting, you can still trade wait. However, there's some details in it that you'll definitely appreciate more having read it. But it's also said in 1981. So that's the thing, is that it's our way of closing out the 1981 storyline. So it's the Christmas party 1981, and the story that Joe Bob is telling is set in 1955 and 1956.
Oh.
So we're again bouncing between times, and it's like I said, it's sort of our way of waving goodbye to 1981. But it is a standalone, so you don't need to have read the Eversol 81 stuff to really enjoy it.
Awesome. Nice. Well, Mike, do you want to jump in with one more question for Chris?
Yeah, just is there anything like we would, without like obviously spoilers or anything, is there anything that we could possibly see like more of a Joe Bob history type of deal? Is there like, because to me, I think he could be a character that could possibly, stand alone just with the story and just kind of what he's made up of. Is there any kind of expand on his story alone?
You mean like a solo series or something?
Yeah, like a standalone, a trade, a one-shot type deal?
I mean, I don't have any plans right now for that. I mean, the idea of doing an Eversol solo would be fun for us. Right. In terms of doing a Joe Bob, we haven't really thought about it. The fun thing about writing the stories of That Texas Blood is that Joe Bob's always in them.
Sure.
He's our anchor, but he's not always necessarily the main character. So for this next arc, for example, like he's definitely in it, and he's a main character in it, but we're very much focusing on another character.
Sure.
Is it a character we've met at all yet?
Yes. And again, that's part of the fun of it, is that we get to explore the past of this person and sort of explore them a little bit more and get to know them. So that way, and this is the kind of thing that I would appreciate as a reader, is that knowing what I know now, I can go back and sort of be like, oh, this person actually was really cool. So yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about doing anything with Joe Bob solo, but it might be fun.
No, but I listen. I want that Eversol book first.
Yeah, so. Yeah, you get the Eversol first.
Let's just help with
Eversol. The fun thing with Eversol is that we can jump all around the country, and he lives in Iowa. He lived in Los Angeles. You can take his show
on the road, baby.
So that's the fun thing about him. And I actually I mentioned I'm writing a story about Iowa, and that's actually this one isn't a comic, it's a novel, but Eversol is a part in that, and it's modern day, so he's much older. So
nice.
Which is kind of fun. Well, I had actually written this even before I'd written Eversol 81. I had written a version of this before I'd written Eversol 81. So I already had this character of Eversol. And I had him as an old man already. So that was kind of part of the fun, was also figuring him out when he was younger, that's something that really I enjoy about telling stories, and the thing that I enjoy about just creating, this sort of world in which these people inhabit, is just sort of figuring out histories.
Yeah.
And giving people a real history. I just feel like everything just feels a lot more, real and just meaty when they have, things that have happened. You as a reader can go along their history and be like, this happened this time, and this happened this time, and this happened this time. It really helps to bring those characters to life.
Yeah, and I think you just hit the nail on the head as to why that Texas Blood is so gripping. Is everything feels real and lived in, and it's just, there's a lot of, I say this a lot on this show. There's an embarrassing wealth of awesome independent books out there right now, but a lot of them you read and maybe you just forget. And it's, oh yeah, I remember that. That was really cool. Hey, you should go check it out. Go buy the trade. That Texas Blood, though, stands out in the crowd because I want to put a copy of this comic in people's hands and be like, go fucking read this.
Don't wait for the trade.
So, you and Jacob are just clearly doing something right. And my hat is really off to you guys, because it's a special comic.
It is.
And just, whatever other adventures you get into in your writing career and your creative career, this is going to always be a highlight for you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
it means
absolutely.
A lot. It really does.
Absolutely, man. Well, hey, Chris, thank you so much for hanging out with us this week. It really has been a pleasure for us to get to hang out and talk about that Texas Blood with you and all that great stuff. So, hey, if you're down, maybe someday we can do it again. That Texas Blood number 12 goes on sale Wednesday, November 24th from Image Comics. You can buy it at your local comic shop. Support your local comic shop, please. Read something cool, and above all, gang, just be good to one another. Next week, Thanksgiving Eve, we have Stephanie Phillips and Peter Krause in the house. Yes, I said that. I did not mean to rhyme it like that. But until then, thank y'all so much, and we will see you next time.